even in this case where the disrupting effects can be quite small, they are devastating to our ability to make the fine judgments that we think we can make.
What are the limits of our knowledge, especially in the way that we assess risk? Well, journalist and broadcaster Michael Blastland, who is part of the Winton Centre at Cambridge University, has written a recent book called The Hidden Half, which seeks to explore the unknown side of knowledge and our understanding of the world. Michael joins us today. Michael, welcome to the CRA channel. Could you tell us briefly, what is this idea of the hidden half, and how does it change the way that we assess risk and understand the world around us?
Human beings are pattern spotters. It's in our nature. This is what we do. I mean, and we do it in every sphere of our lives. We do it on an everyday basis in the way that I recognize, for example, that the brakes on my bicycle slow me down, and I'm kind of relieved about that. And I know it because the mechanism looks like, from previous experiences, a pattern. This kind of thing ought to slow down a mechanism. And also because actually it has, it works. And we know from countless examples, that we take these patterns and we interpret them in ways which imply cause and effect. We say that one thing leads to another. This is simply how the world works. We do it in our business. We do it in economics. We do it in biology. When we're thinking about what kind of medicines we're going to help people. We do it in international development. If we do this program here, will it change that outcome? These kind of patterns of regularity are essentially the way that we form knowledge. And the hidden half the hidden half is a reservoir of all the awkward reasons why those regularities fail. And I think I call it a half because I want to impress that it's a lot larger, I think, than people usually assume. I think the potential for our regularities to fail is a lot greater. Not just because of weaknesses in data, but also because of the complexities of the systems that we're trying to describe. So I'll give you one example, which I'll take from biology, because I think it's commonly assumed that there is a fairly simple trade-off between two regularities in what governs our biology. There is genetics and there is environment. And that's pretty much everything. It's one or the other. Well, a little example causes some difficulty with that. There is a species of crayfish which was discovered in an aquarium in Germany. It just popped up. It didn't exist, not known in the wild, just popped up. First came to recognition in an aquarium, an enthusiast, an amateur in Germany, who discovered that these crayfish he had were parthenogenetic. They were reproducing themselves without sexual reproduction, doing it on their own. Now, there are no other species of crayfish that do this. This was entirely unknown. The assumption is that it just happened spontaneously overnight. Now, this is a brilliant finding. This is a wonderful thing because the geneticists and everybody else gets hold of these creatures and they say, this is fantastic. We can now begin to isolate the different causes, genetics and environment. Because if we put these creatures into a lab and study them, anything that varies them must be environmental. Can't be genetic because the genetics are the same. They're clones, these creatures. So this is what they do. They put them in a lab and everything's identical, except they go a stage further. They make the environment as far as possible identical too. So right down to the same assistant in the lab examining them with the same variety of gloves. The temperatures are the same, the water's the same. They're all fed to excess. There's no competition for food, and on it goes. Quite a lot of them are bred separately in separate tanks, so there can't even be an interaction which affects their environment. So what are they like? Well, some of them from the same batch of eggs vary in weight by a factor of 20. One is 20 times bigger than the other. They have different markings on their carapace, everyone, like fingerprints. They have feeding parts all around the front of their mouth, which are a little bit like teeth. They have different physical numbers of these teeth, and they're genetically identical in an identical live environment. They're behaviorally different. Some of them are loners, some of them are like a crowd, some of them are dominant, some of them are subservient. It goes on and on. They lay their eggs at different points in their lives. They have different lifespans by a factor of 3. There is this astonishing variety when the two biggest regularities, the only two regularities we thought, are entirely consistent, or at least as consistent in the environmental case as we can make it humanly. And you still get this breathtaking regularity. And now there are some explanations for this, but they don't lie in the normal two regularities that we think prevail. And I think that's a lesson. You know, it shows us how we can march for centuries with these dominant assumptions, you know, bringing us to war. You know, we've slaughtered each other over the relative value of power, of environment and genetics. And yet there's this third factor. Now, some people have estimated the influence of this third factor. There are ways you can try and quantify it. And there have been suggestions that in some human circumstances, it's equal to about half the effect. Well, if half the effect is this kind of mysterious third factor no one's ever heard of, that means it's equal to the other two combined. So the biggest two regularities are outweighed, each of them, by some third factor, some third hidden half irregularity that nobody ever talks about. And that's an extraordinary situation, I think. And it just makes you wonder, it just invites the question, how often is this kind of thing, this kind of problem true? How often does it appear?
So, Michael, that's a fascinating example from the natural world. But how does that apply to social phenomena and human behavior when we look at the drivers, particularly of political risk and economic performance, which is the focus of this channel? How does this concept of the hidden half apply to those methods of analyzing the world?
I think it's a very reasonable question, because you might say, well, crayfish are a bit elusive. They're in a tank full of water. We don't know very much about them. People we can talk to, we can understand the reasons, the causes much more thoroughly. Just one quick example. There was a poverty alleviation program in Tamil Nadu in India, where it was discovered that pregnant women were doing something they referred to as eating down. As they became more pregnant, they reduced their calorific intake. And this was because they were frightened that they were going to push out a big baby and the health system would not be able to cope with them. The consequence of that, or one of them, was that they were giving birth to malnourished babies whose chances of survival were much reduced. The program that was brought in there was to try to persuade them that actually healthcare was better than it used to be, to make sure they had adequate food, and to encourage them to think about this link between malnourishment and eating down and the consequences for their own children. And it was a remarkable success, remarkable success. The mothers were very engaged. They took this program to Bangladesh, where there were similar problems, and they applied it there, and it failed. In Tamil Nadu, it had been an outstanding success. In Bangladesh, it failed. And the reason, one of the reasons at least, why it's now thought to have failed is because the head of the household was not the mother in Bangladesh, it was the mother-in-law. Now you can see how you have this massive regularity operating in Tamil Nadu. We have this problem with this consequence. There's a pattern here. And if we intervene in this way, it will correct it. And then we have this other area of the world. And we think if we intervene in the same way, we will repeat the pattern. And it fails because of one weak link in the chain. Now, it's an illustration, really, of the extent to which small details can really corrupt our understanding. I'll give another example from GDP. So GDP is the kind of data that we rely on, both for our forecasts, our understanding of the current state of the economy, for our business investment decisions, and so much else. GDP in the United Kingdom is thought to be relatively accurate. How accurate is relatively accurate? Well, last April, and it's slightly surprising it's taken us all this long, but last April, the ONS produced a research paper which put confidence intervals around GDP. Now, this has not been done before. Extraordinarily, we've not really thought of GDP as suitable to having a confidence interval around it. Our GDP has been trotting along at 0.2, 0.3, occasionally 0.4. You know, that's the kind of range that we've seen a lot of lately. The confidence intervals they're talking about are themselves plus or minus 0.4. So you get a GDP quarterly growth figure of 0.3. It could be very reasonably 0.7, which is borderline boom territory, or it could be minus 0.1, which is the beginning of a technical recession. And it seems that we can't initially tell the difference. Now, if you compare that kind of uncertainty to the tone of the conversation, where Brexit comes along and, GDP varies by 0.1 and people say, Brexit's ruining the country, or, no, Brexit's not ruining the country, Brexit didn't do any harm to the country, or almost any significant event where people are trying to calibrate the effect in these ludicrous ways, really, where you've got an uncertainty which is magnitudes bigger than the degree of effect that you think you can detect. Now, the interesting thing about GDP is that it's pretty good for measuring long-term changes in the overall size of the economy. British economy is about 4 times bigger than it was at the end of the Second World War. And that's a kind of fairly robust statement. But to measure what's going on in the last 1% of the, it's accurate about 90 to 99 to 100. Yeah, we're vaguely right about that, but what the precise changes within that last one, then you get the hidden half. Because what you're trying to do is sample an economy when you don't really know what's in it, particularly in that last part of it. Which new firms have, you can't sample something if you don't know it's there. And this is again the problem of the hidden half, that there are, even in this case where the disrupting effects can be quite small, they are devastating to our ability to make the fine judgments that we think we can make.
So Michael, your book was released in 2019, and we'll link to that in the description below, has a lot of application to the current context with the COVID-19 pandemic. How does this notion of the hidden half apply not only to our understanding of the virology of COVID-19, but also the efficacy of the government responses to the pandemic?
The COVID is an excellent example. The unknowns start from the starting gun, if you like. We did not know right from the off whether this was going to be the kind of infectious disease which just took off, like flame, or it was just going to extinguish. Because we'd had experience of this before, some of the previous infectious diseases, there was alarm about them and they just disappeared. Was this going to be one of those, or was it going to be something different? We didn't know. And the unknowns just kind of rolled in. What was the infection fatality rate? How contagious was this thing? How fatal was this thing? It took us a long time, really, and we simply did not know. And because we did not know, we didn't really know how to act. And those unknowns have continued, as we've said, well, what's the right point in which to lock down? What's the right point in which to come out of lockdown? Does the testing aid our attack on this virus, or does it actually make it worse? Because some of the testing is vulnerable to false positives and false negatives and so on. Some of the quick tests we've been doing. So we have in this country people who are experts who are denouncing one another. Those who want to bring in some of the quicker tests, the lateral flow tests, and use them widely. Those who don't want to bring them in, saying that they actually encourage dangerous behavior. Again, we don't really know the long-term full effect of these kind of interventions. And it could mean that we make negative interventions. We do things which are actively harmful. We talk up our knowledge. Our Prime Minister is fond of talking about game-changing interventions and so on. But we don't know whether they're going to change the game for the good or ill in some cases. And so the proper thing to do would be to try and evaluate these things as we roll them out as far as possible, and to do these things in a structured way, which has some element of trial, which is what you would expect from those people developing the vaccine and what they did. Although even in the case of the vaccine, we're still wondering whether one jab is going to provide adequate protection. Will it be net more beneficial than having 2 jabs? What's the appropriate length of the delay? Again, these are serious unknowns. Should we reopen schools? How dangerous are children? Are they vectors of disease, or are they largely innocent? We don't know whether to blame them or to say that they should be exonerated. So the unknowns roll on. And as I say, I think this should have been a learning moment. I think if we haven't yet clocked our ignorance, through the experience of it, through the COVID, and learnt to stop shooting our mouths off. So find a better way of putting it, but that's the way it strikes me. And a lot of people are doing this, not just the tabloid commentators. It comes from all corners. Then we really should. But then the next stage is to ask ourselves, okay, well, if we have this profound tendency to shoot off our mouths, when we're actually to a significant degree flying blind, maybe we ought to reflect, how often do we do that in other walks of life? How often do we think, business analysis is entirely robust. It justifies this expansion into a new market, because we understand our own market. Well, we have plenty of examples where that's been recklessly dangerous, but the confidence has been there. And so I think one of the lessons is that confidence is no guarantee of a regularity, no guarantee of a pattern. There are tiny aspects of the design stage or the implementation stage which can wreck the whole project. And this is the difficulty when it comes to assessing a risk, that we are always vulnerable to these kind of things, almost however robust we think our initial evidence. Will that evidence generalize to other circumstances, to other markets, to the next project, to the next policy? There are reasons why I think we ought to be more sensitive to the possibility that it won't, and then to plan accordingly. This doesn't mean that we don't take any decisions. We still have to make a decision, but there's a difference between betting the ranch in kind of full-blooded game changer, on top of your white charger, and making decisions where you're sensitive to the hidden half, and you're also aware that in order to get good information, you do have to monitor these things, evaluate them continually, to trial them, to experiment, to use our human ingenuity in the proper sense of the scientific method to try and understand what's actually going on as we make our changes.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. I think when we reflect on the risks that we face in our ordinary lives, it's very important to not fall prey to overconfidence and to be mindful of the second order effects of our actions. My name is David Ansara. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Until next time, take care.